Hey guys, good to see many of you here. I see there are some really die-hard Elvis supporters here. So I hope those of you are huge fans and those of you who are, what's the word, not necessarily big fans, but who are interested, hopefully you guys are going to be able to what's the word, sort of get along with one another. Obviously the big fans are wanting to express their knowledge, and those who don't know what this is about are just curious. So just sort of bear that in mind. Can I just do a quick poll and find out how many of you have watched the movie Elvis? I'm one of them. So I saw the movie last Saturday. It wasn't my idea. I sort of just tagged along, and it was really quite interesting. Not factually 100% accurate, but certainly captured the vibe very well, and sort of ticked a lot of the boxes of things that were situationally and circumstantially true. And obviously, in particular, um, this fellow here, Tom Hanks playing Colonel Tom Parker, right? And he called himself the Snowman. Anyone know why he did that? Zircon said not seen it yet, so hopefully you will. Stephanie says this is new to me. Besides Nick's post on Patreon, Bria, really good to see you. Bria from France. Christy Laura says Nick always does a thorough and thoughtful analysis. Looking forward to it. This is going to be pretty thorough, that's for sure. I must say, Rick the Explorer, that was also my thought, that the snow in the snowman refers to that. And I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's explicitly a reference to making money, making it snow, making money, but sort of from conning people. Okay, so we've got a lot to get through, and for those of you who are huge fans of Elvis, and for those of you who have seen the movie and have a lot to say about it, we're going to do 4 episodes besides this one dealing with this whole story. The one following this one, I think, is dealing with the autopsy. We're also going to be dealing with a timeline. So by all means, this is not going to be, or by no means, this is not going to be a complete, what's the word? It's not going to be complete coverage of the Elvis story. It's 1 out of 5 episodes, right? So in a weird way, what I'm trying to do with this episode is introduce you broadly to the whole story, right? And then we're going to go deeper and deeper as we get through it. And you're going to see it is a story with a lot of layers. SM Kovalinsky says, I haven't seen it yet either. Jody says, haven't seen it. I've seen an older version. Okay. Some of the reviews are saying this is the best portrayal yet of Elvis. And I think the family, Elvis's family, have also sort of signed off on it, saying we're happy with it. For my part, I don't think he looks a heck of a lot like Elvis, but the performance isn't bad. The movie is well done. He doesn't look a lot like Elvis, but I think he does a good job, and I suppose he looks enough like him to sort of get away with it. Okay, Yvonne, good to see you here as well. Stephanie says, I'm so excited. Okay. Okay, so guys, are you ready for me to get started? So shall I go on to another image here? So that is the sort of fairy tale in terms of this particular picture. So sort of fairy tale we have of Elvis as this good-looking, nice guy, very charming, very suave, right? And obviously, you wish you were Priscilla Presley. You wish you were sort of married to him. you can imagine that she's sort of a fairy tale princess, right? That's sort of the cliche in a way, the Elvis cliche. The reality is that, especially towards the end of Elvis's life, do you think it was a fairy tale or something else? Those of you who know true crime know what we're talking about when you talk about fairy tales, right? Well, Yvonne Phillips says, I'm going to see it tonight. So it's going to be very raw in your mind, hopefully. Corporal Deb says, I believe it is one of the best. Corporal Deb, have you seen the movie? Yeah, Louis, yes, I do know about that. Thanks. She was about 14. That's true. When he met her, she was 14. And yeah, but we'll get to that. Okay, so I'm going to get going, and I'll try and sort of interact with you guys, but I've got quite a lot to get through. So the question that we're dealing with here is, did Colonel Tom Parker kill the king, right? And then I'm going to give you 8 reasons why he may have, right? The question sounds quite simple. Did Tom Parker kill Elvis Presley? It seems quite simple, but as we go deeper and deeper into it, you're going to understand that it's actually, although, as I say, it seems extremely simple, the question, yes or no, you're going to see it's got quite a complicated answer, a lot more complicated than you might think. But it's only going to be complicated the more you know about it, right? So we're going to go through the 8 reasons. If you've got a pen and paper, make sure you write number 1 and the first sort of thing. I'll try and reiterate what the 8 reasons are, but it's quite important that you do try and keep, if you don't have physical notes, try and make a mental note of it. Now, before we get started, I just want to show you this image of Colonel Parker, and this is the one this is obviously Tom Hanks portraying the Colonel, and you can see he's quite an overweight guy. He smokes cigars, but this, in a way, does capture him quite well, I thought. Okay, so let's get started. So over the weekend, I watched the biopic Elvis, and I was intrigued by the true crime element overshadowing much of the whole story. And the true crime element really came out right at the end. It also came out when they sort of gave the sort of not end credits, but there was sort of a little message at the end. And when I saw that, it sort of really pricked my the sort of true crime thing. And because it turns out that the most significant actor in Elvis's life was a con man and a crook. I just want to go to this. What is going on here? So I don't want to show that. Yeah, so just from this particular image. So this guy was actually a con man and a crook. Did Elvis know that, or did he not know that? Did he not know in the beginning? Did he find out later? So let's sort of reiterate the question. Did Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's oddball illegal alien handler, did he destroy the king of rock and roll? And I purposefully use the word destroy in the Star Wars sense of the word. You remember the evil emperor. He doesn't just, the evil emperor in Star Wars, the dark side in Star Wars doesn't only want somebody to die, they want to destroy something, right? And that's sort of what I'm talking about here. Was this person trying to destroy the king of rock and roll, or something else? So I use that word on purpose. It'll become more clear what I'm talking about as we go deeper into this. So, as I say, when I arrived home after the movie, I kind of got into bed. I just couldn't sleep, and I had a few questions. So I got up and right through the night started asking questions. I started the investigation by asking a handful of simple questions. One of them was, what were the results of Elvis's autopsy? Simple questions, and you sort of think maybe there's going to be a simple answer. Also, number two, what were the details in terms of the timeline of his death? When you go through that, you also start to raise your eyebrows like, wow, okay. And then the biggest question, did Colonel Tom Parker have an alibi? This was just a question. I was like lying in bed thinking, I wonder, did he have an alibi? And then I tried to find the answer, and I found it quite difficult to find the answer. Where was he? Where was Colonel Tom Parker when Elvis died? And so, with these questions in mind, I started digging and I started my approach. So, by way of introduction to this fascinating line of questioning, I've compiled 8 opening issues, which I think are serious issues. Not like these are little niggly things. Each one of them is a pretty big niggle. We've got serious issues with Colonel Tom Parker. By the way, his name is actually Andreas or Andre Dries Cornelis van Cake. That's actually his real name. So I'll put that in the chat just so that you can see that for sure. Anne says Colonel Parker worked him to death due to his gambling habit. How do I bring this down? Okay, now I want to go to another image. Why is it making it so hard? Okay, just pull that one up. Yes, he was Dutch. Then that brings the whole Van Gogh thing into a startling new perspective. Stephanie says, love to hear how your questions made you think and drove your analysis. So the real question I kind of had was just, obviously, if this guy killed Elvis, then he wouldn't have an alibi, right? Or you would think he wouldn't have an alibi. And so that was my first question. Does he have an alibi? And it was such a hard question to answer that it took me through all of these other details. Okay, so yeah, beginning with the basics. Okay, so now we're going to go into the first issue. Now I'm going to go into the first issue. Shall I make this a bit bigger? Dutch Fugitive, right? Now, those of you who have followed my channel know we've dealt with an American fugitive recently. Since May 2022, we've seen a woman go on the run from Texas to a foreign country. We've seen her change her identity, change her appearance, and manage to evade the authorities for 43 days. Well, what if I told you that this colonel did the same thing? Let's see if I can bring up... is it this one? So there's the colonel sitting beside Elvis, but the image I want to show you is this. It's from Smithsonian Magazine, right? So what if I told you that Caitlin Armstrong, she went on the run from Texas, she went to a foreign country, she changed her identity, she changed her appearance, and she managed to evade the authorities for 43 days. What if I told you that Colonel Tom did the same thing, except not for 43 days, for 58 years? Whoever killed Anna van den Enden on May 27th in Breda in the Netherlands got away with it. So somebody killed a 23-year-old newlywed, her name was Anna van den Enden, on May 27th in Breda, which is the same town that Colonel Tom was from, and her murder has never been solved. Do I need to say any more? ... All right. Corrine Robinson says not watched the movie yet, but wanting to. Elvis fan. Okay. Yes, Stephanie says Dutch. How ironic. Okay, so the plot thickens. The question arises now, was Parker a fugitive in America merely in the sense that he was in the country illegally, without the proper passport or travel papers? Or was his situation similar to the current case of Caitlin Armstrong? Now, remember I said the question, did this guy kill Elvis? I said it actually gets kind of a bit more complicated than that. Well, I think you can see it's already gotten very complicated very fast, because now we're already asking, did he possibly kill someone else? Did he kill someone else at the beginning of this journey to America, right? So according to the Daily Mail, I think it's this article, it says here, did Elvis's tyrannical manager get away with murder as Tom Hanks plays the psychopathic gambler? And by the way, that's not hyperbole. That is actually accurate, calling him psychopathic. And con man, that's also not hyperbole. He was a con man in the new biopic. So he takes a look at the troubling past. So I got a couple of quotes from this article. I'll put a link to the article in chat for those of you interested. Let's try and bring this up a little bit bigger. And so the part that I want to highlight is from the Daily Mail, where it says, quote, the evidence that links Elvis's manager to Anna van den Enden's murder is circumstantial but compelling. Andreas van Kyk almost certainly knew Anna. So when I say Andreas van Kyk, that is the real name of Colonel Tom Parker, right? And so it says here that van Kyk, Tom Parker, almost certainly knew Anna. How do we know? Well, they went to the same church. So it's not as though they just lived in the same town, or they were both just from the Netherlands or something like that. It's like quite direct, right? And we're going to get more detail, and it's going to become more direct in a moment. So that's the first thing just to bear in mind. They went to the same church. And you should think of Loki saying, what more than that? Well, is there more than that? What do you think? Is there more than that? Okay, so it looks like they lived in the same town, and Tom Parker / Van Cake actually made deliveries from the greengrocer's shop where she was found dead. So I don't know whether you can make a connection more explicit than that. Was that he was some sort of delivery boy, and he actually made deliveries from the shop, basically the crime scene where she was found dead, right? Is the plot starting to thicken for you guys? Are alarms going off? Now, what we're starting to do now is investigate this character for another crime completely. And that's sort of where we're taking it. We sort of want to know, did he arrive in America as a fugitive? If so, what kind of fugitive? A fugitive on the lam, a fugitive who'd committed a very serious crime? What kind of fugitive was he? Does that make sense? Corporal Deb, can I just ask you a favor to almost, I know you're an expert on all of this, but can you do me a favor and not sort of jump the gun? I'm trying to go through this step by step. So if you do that, you're going to sort of ruin the narrative that's taken me about 2 days to put together. So I just want to get your response to that, because I've already spoken to you earlier in chat. Another option, Corporal Deb, is maybe that you just watch this live. You watch the movie and then come back and watch the live like another day, when you have watched the movie, because this is kind of in response to that. Connie says Tom Parker killed Elvis's spirit. Connie thinks that Elvis committed suicide. Okay. I don't believe that. Kindness Cake asks, did the Colonel arrive in America alone. Yes, he did. So just to be clear, although I'm going into his fugitive story and I'm reviewing that, and although it's going to feel like there's a fair amount of detail, I am actually going to come back to his story in a lot more detail. So, sort of to just focus on how he came to America and all of that. So although this is going to feel like a deep dive, we're going to do an even deeper dive following this. Pauline says, thanks for telling us things we didn't know. And I didn't know any of this about Colonel Parker. Okay, so Corporal Deb, I've just got to sort of warn you that if you sort of keep what's the word, throwing in information, then I'm going to have to either remove the information or something else. So I'm just trying to ask you nicely to allow me the chance to share my narrative. I'm just saying if you do sort of like say, oh, and the next thing that happens here is that I am going to have to start taking action. So I hope that's okay with you. Liesl McGuire says, this is brilliant, Nick. How you are methodically going through this? I am going to try and methodically go through it. Okay, so the greengrocer's shop, that is where he did deliveries. Now, this is according to the Daily Mail. Parker / Van Cake, so that's the Colonel Parker / Van Cake, it's the same person. He also matched descriptions of the chief suspect. So that's pretty huge. It's not just that the circumstantial thing. Now he's also someone that matches a witness statement. There was a man seen leaving her home behind the grocery shop at around the time of the murder. And then I think this is to some extent speculative, but they say this guy, when he lived in the Netherlands, he was a dock worker, and so he was always short of money. He wasn't a very wealthy fellow, and he may have been interrupted. The person who committed this crime may have been interrupted during a burglary. The point of the crime seemed to be theft, stealing something, specifically stealing money, right? And I think that's a very important motive just to bear in mind is this particular fugitive, who we can't be 100% certain who it was, but he seemed to be someone who didn't want to earn money, wanted to steal money. And so you take that motive and then you ask yourself, as we go through Colonel Parker's story, does this guy also seem like a guy who is unusually money grubbing? And that's going to come forward again and again. So let me just put that in. Van Cake matched the description of the chief suspect. So now it's getting a lot clearer. Okay. And then this is quoting from the Daily Mail, quote, moreover, the killer sprinkled pepper around Anna's body, presumably to stop police dogs picking up a scent. Andre, or Dries, as he was known, had trained circus dogs, and he would have been aware of that ruse. Finally, and most damning of all, he skipped town. His next stop was America. So here is a very interesting, now it's getting even more, not circumstantial, but it's getting even more compelling. The fact that whoever killed this woman sprinkled pepper around the crime scene, and the idea was to confuse the dogs, and only someone who had some experience with dogs would have thought about that. And then again, it starts to make it more possible or likely that it's the colonel. Bear in mind, it's an unsolved murder. So you've got to sort of go, okay, well, maybe, but does it really add up? Does that make sense? Okay, so when I read this, I was the little red flags were going up, and I thought, okay, well, we definitely need more information. And so then I had this is my next question. If you're talking about being methodical, right, in terms of your research, my very next question was, what date did he leave exactly, right? what date did the colonel, whose name was Dries van Cuyk, when did he actually leave Breda? When did he actually leave the Netherlands, right? And that's really important because that also addresses the question of alibi, right? Obviously, if he left before the crime was committed, it's quite a simple open and shut thing. If he left on, let's say, the X of that date, but the crime was committed on the Y of that date, well, then there's no possible way he could have committed the crime. So the question then is, what date did he leave the Netherlands? And then also, what date was this crime committed? That was the next step, right? Liesel says, Nick, I know people were terrified of him, and now this is making more sense. If he was a killer and a proper sociopath. Yvonne Phillips says, we appreciate your cooperation. Okay. So what do you guys think is the answer to that question? Do you guys think that the answer is, okay, looks like he left before the crime was even committed? What do you think is the answer to that? Oh, that's interesting. That's pretty interesting, Romeo. Okay, so this is what I found out. We know he left town on a freighter bound for Florida, and we know that he left town for a freighter bound for Florida in May 1929, right? We also know that Anna was killed on May 27th. So if Parker left, as I say, before the incident, that would obviously clear him. You know, obviously, if he left before the incident, well, then he's cleared. And the thing that's quite interesting is we know that he left in May, but we also know that this lady, this poor lady who was killed, died right at the end of the month. So now you start narrowing it down. You say, did this guy flee his country in the beginning of the month, which would mean he didn't commit the crime, in the middle of the month, which would also mean he didn't commit the crime, towards the end of the month, but not the very end, like the 20th to the 25th, or at the very end of the month, right? And so you again are saying, well, you know, even if he did leave after that, it doesn't make him definitely the killer, but it's certainly you're going to be able to include him or exclude him. Does that make sense? So here's a little bit more backstory on Colonel Tom Parker, or this Dutch fellow, Dries van Cuyk, who will become Tom Parker. This is again quoting from this article, the Daily Mail. Quote, Parker had been to the US before. 2 years earlier, he had crossed the Atlantic, perhaps as a stowaway, and stayed illegally for 18 months, working on traveling shows and carnivals. So he'd obviously gone there before. It's almost like Caitlin Armstrong going to Bali, right? Obviously, she went there legally, but in this case, he went there illegally and sort of had a time in America, and then he went back again, right? But also illegally the second time. Then it goes on to say it's possible that he was deported, meaning from America, or maybe he saved enough money to go home. So they're just saying it's quite strange that he came all the way back to the Netherlands and then went all the way back to America. I think another question that sort of arises is if he ran out of money in America, did he, but he wanted to be in America and he was somehow kicked out of America, did he commit this crime, stealing, you know, murdering this woman, trying to steal some money? Did he do that so that he could go back to America? What was the crime to steal money? The money was so that he could go back to America. And I think it raises another question. Where did he get the money anyway to return to America? I think the question also comes up, was money stolen at this crime scene where Anna, what's her name? Anna, just want to get her name properly. Anna van den Enden, where, you know, was money actually stolen there? I know it seemed like the intention there was to, because there was like rummaging around. It seemed like the intention was theft, but the question is, was money ultimately stolen? So this is the part that I've highlighted that I think is really important. On the night of the murder, he left for America again on a Dutch fishing vessel that eventually docked in Mobile, Alabama. Now, this contradicts what we read somewhere else. Somewhere they said it was a freighter. Now it's a Dutch fishing vessel. And apparently this docked in Mobile, Alabama, not in Florida. So somewhere, some of the information seems to be inaccurate, unless that freight he took to Florida was the first trip. Not sure if that's how it works. But the part that is really significant is on the night of the murder, he left for America. And that's starting to make it look like a very, very strong case that he's involved, just circumstantially. So if you had to try and prove it in court, it would be difficult, but in terms of circumstantially, now it's starting to look extremely compelling, isn't it? I see some of you are really jumping to right to the end of the story. Okay, so let's go on to what happened after that. So he arrives in Mobile, Alabama, and according to the article, quote, he slipped illegally into the country a second time and resumed his life as a carny. That's sort of another word for sort of a shortened version of a carnival worker, right? Working mainly as an elephant handler for carnival based in West Virginia, right? So that's sort of where he starts his journey, right? If you're thinking of Caitlin Armstrong, she started her journey in St. Teresa. Well, West Virginia was his St. Teresa. Then at this point, he also changed his name to Thomas A. Parker, just like Caitlin changed her name to Ari and whatnot. He changed his name to Thomas A. Parker. And he also listed his birthplace as Huntington, West Virginia. Now, you've got to ask, if he just sort of went over, why would he change his name? Why would he change his birthplace? And there's an innocent explanation, which is, well, he wants to live in the country, so he wants to be, what's the word? He wants to fit in, right? But I mean, the fact is, he is Dutch. He speaks with a Dutch accent. He's obviously Dutch, and Thomas A. Parker isn't Dutch. But anyway, so he changes his name, and he also changes his birthplace. Now you've got to ask, is that the sign of a criminal or a murderer, or just a liar, right? So, as I say, we've got to ponder, if Van Cake was innocent, why did he change his name? Why did he leave the Netherlands so abruptly? Now, this is another part that's really important to remember. So if you're saying, you know what, I think he's innocent. I think it's just a coincidence that he left the same day this woman from his hometown where he went to church was murdered. But then you've also got to ask, why did he leave and he never actually came back? He didn't even come back to say hello to his family. Remember, he was like quite a young guy. I think he was like 19, 20 years old. So think about it. He never returns. Not only that, why does he leave when he did? Why not leave? You know, did he tell his family, I'm planning on going to America and I booked a ticket? Did they know that? What do you think the answer is to that? And the answer actually is he didn't even tell his family where he was going, right? I've got to provide a little asterisk to that and say he did tell his family he was safe once he arrived in America. He didn't tell them before he was leaving that he was leaving, but once he arrived, he did say I'm safe. And then after that, he broke contact. And I think that raises a really interesting question is, why would he tell them he's safe and then break contact? Or even just, why would he tell him he's safe? Well, wouldn't you say that the reason is he doesn't want them, his family, to start an investigation? He doesn't want his family to be like, our brother is missing, we need everybody to look for him. He kind of wants that not to happen, right? He wants there not to be an investigation. He wants to be like, hey guys, I'm safe. I'll speak to you guys a little bit later, but everything's fine. And then he obviously eventually breaks contact, and then they think, well, there's nothing to see here, kind of thing. The other thing that comes through over time is just how hard it is to find out about Van Cuyck's past, right? That's no accident. It's quite difficult. And there's a woman called, I think it's Elena Nash. I might be mispronouncing her name, but she wrote a book about him, and it took her a long, long time to write it. And she went to the Netherlands, she went and spoke to his family, and she nevertheless experienced a lot of difficulty finding out about him, even though his family cooperated. So another aspect we need to apply in terms of criminal psychology is whether there are any signs or symptoms of the criminal psychology in the crime surfacing in Elvis's manager's personality or psychology. And this is where it sort of true crime rocket science sort of comes to the fore, where you say, I sort of intuit a kind of psychology. There's a kind of mentality at work in the Bradar crime scene. Something's going on there, and I recognize certain things that are going on. There's this ability of somebody to drop everything and leave. You know, how many people can drop everything and leave like that? How many people can have the self-discipline in a way to make a completely new life and not sort of be in touch with other people? I mean, think about Caitlin Armstrong and her sister, right? Here's a guy who just goes it alone and doesn't look back. What kind of psychology do you need to have in order to do that successfully? But just in a more general sense, is the fabric of the crime, is the psychological fabric, is that going to materially mirror the what's the word, the manager's personality or psychology, right? Do you follow what I'm saying? Is some of the essence of the fabric of the crime in Bradar, is some of that going to sort of float over, and we're going to recognize it coming up, sort of drifting up almost like true crime dust in the manager's life going forward, right? So that's a question just to kind of put in the back of your mind, right? And then some more general questions. Was the colonel, was this guy here? See if I can. Was this guy violent? I mean, does he look violent? Funnily enough, do you see the dogs in the background there? Anyway, was the colonel violent? Does he look violent? Was the colonel greedy? Does he look greedy? Was the colonel underhand and crafty? Does he look underhand and crafty? Not that optics tell you everything, but they sometimes tell you something. And then another thing is, was the colonel good at getting away with things? So we want to ask all of those questions in terms of the crime in Bradar, but also in terms of the well-documented story of the colonel and Elvis, right? So as I say, and that sort of brings to an end this part of his backstory. Bear in mind, we will continue our investigation into Colonel Tom's backstory in the Netherlands in a follow-up post. So the first point, remember I said the 8 reasons why this fellow may have killed Elvis. Well, the first one is Dutch fugitive. And it's not a question, was he a Dutch fugitive or wasn't he? He definitely was. He was a Dutch fugitive. The question is, was he just a Dutch fugitive? You know, did he have, was his passport papers not in order? Or was it that and something a lot worse? So number 1 is Dutch fugitive, and you can read into that as little or as much as you want to. Now we come to the second aspect, con artist, and this is starting to describe this particular person, right? And if you think I'm being unfair or unkind, they actually use this term in their headline here, con man, right? You see over there, con man. they also talk about psychopathic gambler, but there it is, con man, right? And here it is as well. Was he a killer on the lam, right? He also went to a lot of trouble to keep his past secret. What past was he hiding? And here's an image of him. Interestingly enough, there's a dog in this picture as well. And this is where he serves in the US Army, right? So we'll come back to that. Why is it? Can I do it like that? You can't really see it so well over there, but anyway, bear it in mind. So have a look at some of your comments. His eyes are intense and watchful. Man's best friend. Okay. It's pretty, I can't move this more to the right, but anyway. Okay, so let's continue. Now we come to the second point, con artist. Does that look like a con artist to you? So obviously in true crime, we need to know more than what somebody looks like, right? But in this case, I think it is something worth thinking about. How one looks, how one behaves, how one dresses, how one speaks, what one says, all of those things sort of add up. So again, according to the Daily Mail, really good article. Of course, we're also going to be going into other sources. The key features of Parker's character took root early. That's a very important sort of line of questioning, is what is going on with this guy? What is his character? I'm talking about in America, right? So we're pondering what his character may have been when he was in the Netherlands, but the question is, what is his character now? And according to the writer, it sort of takes place pretty early. The key features of his character take root pretty quickly. It's not like a mystery. He starts hustling, right? And this is according to his biographer. Let me just read the paragraph here. Quote, the key features of Parker's character took root early. As Nash, that's his biographer, writes, these included a need to hustle rather than make money honestly, and his delight in the con as the highest form of creative achievement. So here you can see that there's obviously a criminal psychology with this guy who he prefers the idea of stealing your money or conning you out of your money and hustling than actually making money honestly, right? And then the question is, what do you think about the guy who murdered Anna van den Enden? Did that person also think about, well, I'm not going to get money honestly, I'm going to steal it from you? And then maybe he was interrupted or caught or something like that, right? So this is something in terms of his character that you see very early on, is that this guy, it's not like he becomes a hustler in his 40s or 50s. He's a hustler from the word go, right? And the other part that's really fascinating is he delights in the con. He really enjoys it. He enjoys taking money at someone else's expense, and not just a little bit. He really enjoys it, and that's going to come up, and that comes up in the movie as well. So for whatever reason, Parker thought it was better or easier to make money by conning people, that is stealing from them, rather than doing so honestly. And if you think about it, if he was in America illegally, it may have been difficult to make an honest living to begin with, without the right papers to start off with. That being said, Parker could also elect to be honest. Or so once he'd been in America for a while and things were starting to move in a certain way, you could say, okay, I've struggled. Now I'm going to be honest from now on. Do you think he did that? Do you think he was actually an honest guy and he just had difficulty in the beginning? Or do you think he was dishonest to begin with and he became more and more dishonest, and the dishonesty became more and more egregious, right? So let me ask you again. He could have elected to be honest or more honest in terms of, for example, his dealings with Elvis, and particularly in terms of as Elvis's manager. Do you think he was he became more honest or less honest. Here's another picture of him. So what choice do you think he made over and over again? Bear in mind, his choices in the beginning seem to be about money. What do you think the choices he made over and over again? And do you think he thought of people as more important than money, or money as more important than people? And think about him going to America, leaving his family behind, almost without a second thought, and doing then what he ends up doing. And isn't that the beginning of where you put your own family behind your interests, right? What do you think are the consequences of those choices, of doing that? What do you think are the consequences of putting money in front of people? What do you think happens when you do that? And that brings us to the third possibility here, why this person may have actually killed Elvis, and that is greedy glutton. Now, in photos of Parker, the Dutchman always looks overweight. You can sort of see it there, but is there another one? Okay, well, that is not a picture of Parker, but it is a picture of Tom Hanks as in the role of Parker, but you can see he's supposed to be quite a fat guy. Here, Tom Hanks is sort of wearing prosthetic makeup to make him look a lot more overweight than he is. Where's that other image I've got of him? So there you can see he's younger, but nevertheless portly. Where is that other one? Yeah, I guess if we look at the image in the the image that's behind me, you get a sense that he's somewhat overweight here, right? Suppose that's sufficient. But basically, in most photos you see of him, he looks overweight, but there's actually a method behind that. He didn't just get overweight because he liked eating ice cream or whatever. A circumstance actually led to it becoming part of Parker's identity, right? So if you think that Caitlin Armstrong had surgery to change her nose, to change her appearance, Parker seemed to use putting on weight. I'm not sure if it is necessarily to change his appearance so that no one would recognize him, because bear in mind, this wasn't the age of social media or, they did have newspapers, but, you didn't really even have TV. In the early days, but there was a method to this, and the reason why he put on weight was so that he could dodge the draft, right? So, according to the Daily Mail quote, Parker later dodged the Second World War draft by purposefully ballooning his weight north of 300 pounds. Again, that shows you quite either a very opportunistic kind of mind, a very what's the word, sly psychology, or something worse, doesn't it? In my opinion, this is not just a crafty trickster, but someone who's willing and able to dodge accountability. It's also ironic that Parker would avoid the draft, right, only to advise Elvis to join the army. So he would make sure that he avoided the draft, but then he tells Elvis, you need to join the army. And in Elvis's case, the idea is we need to make you, it's like the colonel telling Elvis, we need to make you, my client, seem like a good citizen. So you need to join the army because we need you and I need you to seem like a good citizen to your countrymen. But I'm not going to do that. And do you see it kind of shows a sense of exceptionalism, things that Parker wouldn't do, he would expect others to do. And I think it also shows his ability to manipulate Elvis. Do you agree with that? The fact that he wouldn't do something, but he expects Elvis to do it, and then Elvis does do it, also shows his ability to manipulate Elvis. Colonel Deb mentioned this right in the beginning, and now's the time that I want to sort of deal with it. Ironically, the Colonel part of Tom Parker's name is actually based on truth, right? So you might say, oh, so I guess that's not true either. Well, actually, it is, but not really in a military sense. So according to biography.com, quote, Parker was given the title of colonel in the Louisiana State Militia by Louisiana Governor Jimmy Davis. Now that might seem like he was in the military and he was a colonel, but the state actually had no organized militia. And so this title of colonel was really an honorary title, right? It was based around what Parker did to support Jimmy Davis in 1948. So this is shortly after the Second World War, right? So not only does he avoid going to war by getting fat, but he somehow becomes a colonel anyway, if that makes sense. And he must have thought this was hilarious. What I mean is, he doesn't go and fight in the Second World War, but then he comes out of the other side of the Second World War and now suddenly he's a colonel, but not really a real colonel, right? So this is an honorary title, and as I say, given in return for Parker's efforts, political efforts, marketing efforts, in terms of Davis's campaign. And obviously that campaign succeeded because Jimmy Davis became the governor of Louisiana, right? If you think that Parker sort of wasn't in the military at all, that's also not true. It also adds a layer of complexity. He did serve 2 years in the U.S. Army in the 30s. Remember, he left the Netherlands, I think, 1929. So I think he must have spent about 2 years, 1 or 2 years in circuses. Then he went to the army. He went to Hawaii's Fort Shafter. And when his tour ended in 1931, he re-enlisted. And this is where it gets quite interesting, showing his character traits. So he re-enlists for whatever reason. He then deserts the army again a year later. For whatever reason, he feels like this isn't what I really want. And then as a result of desertion, he was punished with solitary confinement. And then he suffered a psychotic breakdown. Now you've got to ask yourself, if he can put on a lot of weight in order to avoid the draft, if he can get onto a fishing boat or a freighter to avoid another kind of accountability, was this psychotic breakdown an actual psychotic breakdown or was it an act? Bear in mind, this is a very manipulative fellow, right? So when he has the psychotic breakdown, and this is really important, the military doctor sent him to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in D.C., Washington, D.C., and he was later discharged from the Army in 1933 at age 24. So he deserted in 1932, and the next year he was discharged, I would imagine dishonorably, but I don't know that for a fact, at age 24. So what I think, just my opinion, is that the desertion once again shows Parker mischievously trying to avoid accountability, but this time in the armed forces. What does he do? As I say, if he manufactured his weight gain as a ruse to avoid being drafted for World War II, was his psychotic breakdown in 1932 real or performance? What do you guys think? Think it was real or a performance? Bear in mind, he's a showman, right? He's a guy who's in the circus who deals with performances all the time. He becomes the manager of a performer. So do you think this was his psychotic breakdown was real or performance? I just think it's an interesting question. So we've dealt with number 1, Dutch fugitive, number 2, con man, number 3, greedy glutton. Just try and remember these if you're not writing them down. And then number 4 is manipulative psychopath. So this is really significant. It's not some true crime person saying, well, I think he doesn't have a heart, he's a psychopath. It's literally a medical kind of diagnosis that he gets from Walter Reed Army Medical Center. They are the ones that actually label him a psychopath. It's in his discharge papers. That is also huge, right? And so for once, the psychopath label actually fits. Now, again, you've got to take the psychopath label and you've got to breathe life into it and say, is the person who committed the crime in Breda the person who killed Anna van den Enden? And there you need to find out more about what happened. How was she killed? What were the circumstances there? Does this feel like a psychopath, right? Also, the way the psychopath then acts, does that feel that way? In the same way, you've got to look at the trajectory of the Colonel's career with Elvis and say, did he take care of Elvis? Was he a nice guy to Elvis? Was he like a sensitive human being? Did he basically just care for Elvis, right? Or was he a psychopath? And that brings us to this interesting headline here. Is it this one? The shadowy past of Colonel Tom Parker, who was diagnosed as a psychopath in the army and accused of fleeing his home country, right? So let's have a look at some of your comments. Are things starting to come together with you guys? Are you starting to see how things are starting to link? Okay, so now we deal with manipulative. Sorry, we're still busy dealing with that. Okay, so in terms of the manipulative psychopath aspect, if we suspect that Elvis's tyrannical manager, if we suspect him not only of one murder but double homicide, what can be said with some certainty is that Colonel Parker exhibited numerous traits, made numerous statements that made him appear heartless and manipulative. Right? It's not just he did something here and there. It's a pattern of behavior. Now, I must also tell you this, and it's kind of jumping the gun, that quite a few people besides Elvis and Anna van den Enden die around him, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. And I'm not trying to create a conspiracy here, I'm simply giving you information, and bear it in mind, and I'm not trying to say that he necessarily killed any of these people, just that these people died, and that is something we need to investigate. I'm not trying to imply that he's responsible, but I'm asking the question, what are the circumstances then of these deaths? And they could be innocent. I'm just a little bit uncomfortable because it's not just one or two, it's three. So the first death is Elvis's mother, who dies when he's away in the military. And you could say that's completely innocent. She drank herself to death. Well, that ends up being the same way Elvis dies, right? Is that a coincidence? And you might say it's just a coincidence. Then there's also Elvis's father dies 2 years after he dies. Is that also just coincidence? And bear in mind, Elvis died at 42 years of age. So his father couldn't have been very old, maybe mid-60s, right? Not very old. And then there's the third death is the death of his wife, the death of Colonel Parker's wife. And I think that happened I think it was somewhere around 1980, but I think quite close to the time that Elvis died as well. So if you think about it, 5 people die in the story: Anna van den Enden, Elvis's mother, Elvis's father, and the Colonel's wife. So in terms of his pursuit of making money out of Elvis, now this is a really interesting and quite disturbing aspect. We've already said he seems like quite a greedy, guy. He's a con man and he really loves money. Now, when you take a specific example of that, you say, in his pursuit of making money out of Elvis at Elvis's expense, not, so you might say, in terms of the poll, should Elvis have trusted the Colonel? You might actually say, yes, he should have. Why? Because the Colonel, if the Colonel was making money for himself, he was also making money for Elvis. And maybe there is this murk around him, but maybe there's nothing to it. Maybe it's just that he's a strange oddball, right? But this is where it takes another turn, where you start going, this is really seems not very good. And the issue is, we makes money out of Elvis at Elvis's expense. We literally printed out "I hate Elvis" badges to sell as well. And yeah, you can see an example of them, right? And it's not only "I hate Elvis," he also had, I think, "Elvis is a jerk." That's another one. I think that's there. Elvis is a jerk and "I hate Elvis." Right? That's from this article. The ingenious way Elvis Presley, but should actually be his manager, even made money off his haters. And that is from CBC. Okay. You see how the plot is thickening? Gathering Place says Elvis was only the workhorse. Joy says the Colonel took more money than Elvis did. Well, see, you guys aren't actually able to see what I'm showing you. So I want to show you that and this article here. There you can see those badges. Elvis is a jerk. I hate Elvis. So you're selling "I hate Elvis" badges. So your client is Elvis, but he's selling "I hate Elvis" badges. Is there another? I think I had another one here. There it is. So he's definitely quite an opportunist and interesting mind. Liesel McGuire says a proper con man, definitely. Stephanie says, wow, that's not for Elvis's benefit, that's for sure, absolutely. So here you can see it really explicit, the kind of character that we're dealing with. So Parker figured that if there was a huge market for those rebellious teens who loved Elvis, there had to be a market for those who hated him as well, perhaps parents, or boys who didn't like a particular brand of music, or uptight religious folk. But if there were people who loved Elvis, there had to also be people who didn't like him, and then he would cater to both of them. And it really didn't bother him whether, what Elvis thought about it, kind of thing, or how it reflected on Elvis. Now, in the movie Elvis, Tom Hanks's Parker is appalled by the racy headlines written about his charge. Let's just bring up. So here's actually the director of the movie, Baz Luhrmann. I just want to bring up that image of Tom Hanks. Is it this one? Yeah. So if you go and watch the movie, you'll see how Tom Hanks playing Parker is appalled when he sees these racy headlines in the paper. He's disturbed by it, he's worried. But in reality, Parker used the counterintuitive "I hate Elvis" badges to make money. In the same way that he did that, he also used the media to stage negative, indignant, and sensational headlines to draw attention to his attraction. And he kept referring to Elvis as his boy and as his attraction. That kind of gives you a sense that he's already dehumanized Elvis. Elvis is just a means to an end for him, right? Now, if you say, oh, I understand what you're saying. If you say, in the same way that he made "I hate Elvis" badges, he actually used the media to make sensational headlines, you might say, oh, is that what he did? When you don't know what that means without actually going through an example of that, which is what we're going to do right now. So there's an article in Vanity Fair. So it's really important to deal with this because the movie doesn't deal with it. So the movie actually goes into a bit of a fake newsy aspect with this. I can understand why, because they're trying to show him maintaining control and that sort of thing. So that's from this article. And it's actually written by the biographer, the person who wrote a book on the Colonel. I've actually been wanting to order the book, but the paperback version is really expensive. So I just haven't ordered it yet. I don't know if someone wants to gift it to me, but I'm just trying to make up my mind whether to order it. So she's really in a good position to know what is right about the movie and what isn't. So obviously there's spoilers in it. If you haven't watched the movie, you probably don't want to read this, but I'll put a link in chat for those who are interested. So it's a good article, and it's from this article that she dispels this sort of rumor. In other words, we're dealing with this whole idea of, is he really appalled by the racy headlines written about Elvis? And so, according to Vanity Fair, according to this article, quote, the Colonel encouraged anything that grabbed headlines and created controversy for his boy. I think those words, his boy, those are used deliberately. That's how I thought of him, as his boy. On October 30th, 1957, the day after the second of two Elvis shows at the Pan Pacific Auditorium, Variety ran the headline, LA police order Presley cleanup. Order that Presley clean up his Pan Pac show, right? And then, so the LA police actually are referenced in this news headline, and they're saying Elvis needs to clean up his show. And I think it was to do with him swaying his hips and doing whatever he was doing. And bear in mind, this is 1957. This is where it gets interesting. Quote, Hollywood publicist Gene Schwam recently revealed to Variety the story behind the headline. Told that the second show wasn't moving tickets, Schwam, taking a suggestion from Parker, called the police and said he'd heard that Elvis was getting too risque for the kids. Then he told the press what the police said. The second show sold out. I find that pretty incredible. It's kind of brilliant, and it's also pretty sneaky. Yeah, Kindle is 629. Yeah, don't shoot me. I would like to read it, the paperback version. Joy says Parker manipulated everything to his own benefit. Yeah, Stephanie says, why is the book $100? I think that's the hardback. Anyway, so isn't that incredible? So this news headline actually comes from Parker in a way. Parker says, Parker calls the police after the first concert doesn't really go very well. He calls the police and he says, Elvis's behavior just wasn't right. And then the police give a response, and then that's what he puts into the newspaper. And then this obviously attracts the attention of people in a way that it often does. And then the second show sold out. So he could understand how negative and even dishonest publicity could work, right? So I think this is the sort of brilliantly crafty thinking that true psychopaths are known and in some cases admired for. Do you guys agree with that? Brilliantly crafty thinking that I think shows that he is truly psychopathic. Because only a psychopath can think with that kind of clarity, even though he's actually telling a lie and is deceiving a lot of people. I think naturally, if there's an upside to such effective but emotionally detached strategy, there's also a downside. So if you say, you know what he did, he managed to sell tickets, that's the upside. He's a clever guy. Is there a downside to that kind of behavior? And I think this is the downside. Because Parker benefited directly from Elvis's success, he didn't care about anything that didn't benefit him, right? So again, you've got to ask yourself the question, what does that mean? What does it mean to say, there's a downside to that psychopathy? There's a downside to that. And if he didn't care about something that didn't benefit him, how was that downside? How did it manifest, right? What's an example of that? So here is an example. If it was important for Elvis to star in serious movies, it wasn't important to Parker. And that is exactly something that was that way. It was important for Elvis to star in serious movies. He didn't want to be in these somewhat silly movies, these musicals. He didn't want it always to be about selling records. I think at one point, Barbra Streisand wanted Elvis to star alongside her in A Star Is Born, and Elvis very much wanted to be part of that. But then Parker couldn't see how that would be of any benefit to him. In fact, he saw it in the opposite way, that it was going to draw Elvis away, that other people were going to have his ear, that he's going to be open to a whole new world of opportunity, and perhaps even be influenced by Barbra Streisand. And he didn't like that idea. But the main reason he didn't like it was he didn't, he wasn't a very significant, he would lose his significance, and he would lose his power and control if he allowed that to go forward. And obviously, it would be good for Elvis, right? But what was good for Elvis wasn't always good for him. And when it wasn't good for him, then he didn't allow Elvis to do it. And that's also where you've got to kind of got to ask, what is going on with Elvis? Shouldn't Elvis sometimes have stood up for himself? Shouldn't Elvis have put his foot down? What is actually going on there? And that does actually come up in the movie, and I'm not going to spoil it. But there is a moment where Elvis does try to fire the colonel, and then you actually see what happens. And he feels like he can't. But still, even though he doesn't ultimately fire the colonel, you sort of wonder how he managed to stick around the way that he did. And I think that also speaks to the criminal mischief of this particular fellow. So the question is always, how would Parker benefit? That was the question for himself. How am I going to benefit out of this? How are we going to sell more tickets or make more money? And so, as stated in Vanity Fair, Parker only took credit for Elvis's success. He wouldn't accept any blame for his demise. Again, that is a psychopathic way of dealing with something. It's if you think about the shooting of Helena Hutchins, you would think that a normal person would have said, I feel responsible for what happened, or I take the blame. You would think that someone who says, I didn't feel to blame at all for anything, you would think that that is not how a normal person would think in terms of that. That's sort of what I'm getting at. So while we are investigating whether Parker, aka Dries van Cake, could have murdered Elvis, another way of looking at it, particularly through the psychopath psychology, is whether Parker could have or should have saved him. So if you say he didn't actually plunge the knife in, right, metaphorically, if you say, look at it from another perspective, and you say he was in a position where he could have or he should have saved Elvis, and he didn't or he wouldn't. Does that make sense? That's another way of looking at the question. That's why I said it starts getting a lot deeper. LB says 1969 was Elvis's best year, in my opinion. Stephanie says he looks like he's straight out of The Sopranos. Okay. So something else I want to draw your attention to is, and I hope I can find the right image. So it's this one. It's this one here. And is it that one? Yeah. So have a look at that image and this image, and look how similar they sort of look. Is it this one? They're actually starting to look similar. Okay, not that one, that one. You see how they're starting to actually look similar? The mouth, but just the general appearance, right? And that's something I noticed. It's weird how grotesquely fat Parker seemed to eventually make Elvis in his own image. Do you see that? That Parker eventually seems to make Elvis in his own image. At the end of his life, Elvis was too overweight. Elvis was also overweight and unhealthy. Just in the simple sense of ordinary gluttony and hedonism, Parker wasn't a good influence. So if you take everything away, the money, the drugs, the fame, everything, and you just say, in a very simple sense, Parker seemed to make Elvis into himself, into a fat person, right? And was there a method to that? So going back to our analysis, Parker was also manipulative, according to Alana Nash, the biographer, who met Parker in person and spent 6 years investigating him while compiling his biography. Parker was interested in what Nash thought and knew, right? So he actually finds out that she's writing a biography about him, and he wants to know. And so according to The Guardian, quote, Parker seemed to taunt me. These are Nash's words. Parker seemed to taunt me, to invite me to explain, if not to himself, to others. But then, just as quickly, he attempted to exercise control, erecting one hurdle after another. So you have the sense of someone whose temperament can change on a dime, someone who's very excessively controlling, manipulative, and also tries to prevent her from writing a book. And when she ultimately published the book on Parker, it was after he had died. Yeah, I think another thing to think about is if Parker influenced Elvis in terms of what he was eating, didn't he also influence him in terms of the substances he was consuming? I mean, isn't that the best way to control Elvis through his addiction? You provide him with the drugs, you get him to do what you want him to do. Isn't that just the simplest lever of all of them to control someone? Louise, you bring something quite interesting up there. You said the narcissist brought Elvis down. Do you think there's just one narcissist in the story? Do you think the narcissism is just from the Colonel's side? Do you think Elvis is sort of the innocent victim, or there's some narcissism on his side too? John Hammer says millions can love you, one bad one can take it all away in many ways. Okay, so let's continue. So something else to consider is if Parker was able to control and limit a journalist, and a journalist he hardly knew, why wouldn't he do the same to Elvis? Think about the cliche in true crime about staging and a stage manager who stages things for a living. Alana Nash also wrote in Vanity Fair that her impression of Parker was that he trusted no one. Was that because he was a psychopath with an innocent conscience or a guilty one? Did he trust no one because he was an innocent psychopath, or a very guilty one. Sorry, I wanted to highlight this. He trusted no one. So if you think about our poll, the poll is basically, should Elvis have trusted his manager? Well, his manager trusted nobody, and it seems like his manager didn't even trust Elvis, right? So you've really got to ask yourself, should Elvis have trusted his manager? And for once, by far the overwhelming majority of you are right. 91% say no. 91% say no, he shouldn't have trusted him. The only aspect is that his manager did to some extent make Elvis some money, but I mean, that was his job. Should he have trusted him beyond that? I agree with 91% of you. I definitely agree with that. Okay. Stephanie says he should have been able to trust him, but he was dishonest. Liesl McGuire says, wow, Nick, this is so profound. Give the boy all the peanut butter, banana, and honey sandwiches he wants alongside fried chicken and drugs, and boom, you can take all his money for gambling. Yeah, well said. That is profound. So if we revisit the psychopathy of the crime itself, the one in Breda, the one in the Netherlands, we've got to ask, are there elements of psychopathy inherent in that crime? And the answer is yes. The crime was so brutal, and I apologize for the graphic nature of what I'm going to say. Fair warning what I'm about to say, it's a bit graphic. The crime was so brutal in Breda in 1929, the victim's brains actually came out of one ear due to the force that her head was struck with a crowbar. She literally had her brains bashed out. This heartless act, apparently for money, was immediately followed by cool-headedness, spraying pepper on the ground to interfere or limit or control the ability of the dogs to track his scent. And that is that's the concluding section dealing with number, what was it? Number 4, manipulative psychopath. So now we go into number 5, Elvis's funeral. So you may not have noticed until now, we have dealt for the most part with the Colonel. We haven't spoken much about Elvis. We haven't spoken that much about his circumstances or anything. Well, now we're going to deal with that a little bit more here. And it becomes relevant because we've got to ask the question simply but explicitly. How do we measure Parker's psychopathy accurately as Elvis's manager? If you're just saying, okay, so he's a psychopath, how do we measure and how do we see the influence of that in Elvis's life? Like, where do we begin to test and evaluate that, right? So I'm going to put that question into chat. Thanks a lot, Stephanie, for the book fund. Yeah, appreciate that. I think I'm going to have to buy that book now. Stephanie, you've forced my hand. But thanks very much. I appreciate it. So any options from you guys? How do we measure Parker's psychopathy accurately as Elvis's manager? Where do you begin to start with that process? Well, I think thanks a lot, Yvonne. I think super chats are on a roll now. If you guys want to super chat, now's the time. What is the book? The book is The Colonel. Let me bring it up for you guys. The Colonel by Alana Nash. Here it is. I see it's also sold by Simon and Schuster. or it's, well, I guess it's published by them. List price $19.99. I think that's probably one of the most authoritative versions of the story, which is why I want to kind of get hold of it. So there you go, Pauline. So Zircon says, not sure how to measure. The answer is, well, point number 5 is you go to the funeral. You go to Elvis's funeral and you ask, how did this fellow behave at Elvis's funeral, right? What sort of behavior did this person exhibit at Elvis's funeral, right? And what do you think the answer is? Do you think that he was respectful? Do you think that his behavior was appropriate? Do you think that what do you think? What do you think about that? Louise, thanks very much. Louise says, sad but interesting topic. I must say I agree with you that it is ultimately a very sad story. When we deal with the autopsy and all that, it's incredibly sad, incredibly sad. Robbie Robbins says inappropriate. Okay, so let's deal with that. So the question is, how do we measure Parker's psychopathy accurately as Elvis's manager? Well, a good place to start. It's not the only place you can look at, but a good place to start are Parker's behaviors following Elvis's sudden death on the morning of August 16, 1977. And dealing with this, in order to deal with this, we can go to a generic source, which is just Wikipedia, right? So I'll put a link to that if you guys want to check it out yourselves. But this is how he behaved. According to Wikipedia, quote, some accounts suggest Parker acted as if nothing had happened. So here, this person who's so beloved by the whole of America, even a lot of the world. I mean, I must still tell you, my father absolutely, his favorite musician of all time was definitely Elvis. So you've got this beloved musician who's shaped, in some ways, shaped American culture, changed lives, brought so much happiness and romance and whatnot, right? So much spirit to the 60s and the 70s, right? And then when Elvis dies, his own manager, the person that should have been closer to him than anyone, seemed to act as if nothing had happened. And what does that mean to say he acted as if nothing had happened? It's like he didn't die. It's like he's died, and then he doesn't mourn, he doesn't weep, his work doesn't stop. There's just like no interruption, right? And you would think, what would the first thing be for what should his manager do first? So let's just imagine hypothetically. I don't really know what the situation was, but let's imagine hypothetically a telephone rings and Colonel Parker finds out that Elvis has died. What do you think the first thing he could or should do under those circumstances? What should the first step possibly or probably be in terms of that? Thanks a lot, Liesel. Thanks a lot for that. Robbie Robbins says no empathy at all. Zircon says, I cried that day. Anne says it was business as usual. Yeah. There we go. Jody says, console the family. You would think that he would go to Graceland, he would go to the mansion, and he would be there to support the family. Bear in mind, Elvis has got a daughter. Elvis's father's there. But you would imagine that he would go there and support the family. Almost, and maybe not the best example, but in the John Benet Ramsey case, what happens with John Ramsey's other children? they come to Boulder, right, to show support, right? As I said, it's not the best example, but just think about it. Julie says, I'm late, but I can say TCRS plus Elvis discussion equals perfect. Julie's got the benefit of having read the script, so good to have you here. Yeah, so Jody, you're absolutely right. Console the family. And so do you think he does that? Just Dear says, big Elvis fan here. So do you think he does that? Do you think he, let's just say hypothetically, gets the phone call, Elvis has died. Do you think he goes to Graceland? Do you think he goes and supports the family? What do you think he does? Now you've got to think, what would a psychopath do, right? And the answer is, this is the answer from Wikipedia. Before even visiting Graceland to pay his respects to Elvis's family, Parker traveled to New York City to meet with merchandising associates and executives with RCA Records, instructing them to prepare for a huge demand in Presley products. Shortly afterward, he traveled to Memphis for Presley's funeral. Now, I don't know if that doesn't make you sort of boil in your boots. You know, I don't know if that doesn't make you extremely angry. And I don't know if that doesn't just what's the word, capture who this guy is in a nutshell. Just that one moment, I think that really captures the true spirit of the Colonel and Elvis. I think it captures that in a nutshell. So the first thing he does is he goes to sort out merchandising. Remember the thing about these things. That's kind of not, obviously he's not going to print badges, but that's really what he's preoccupied with, is that. Real piece of work, isn't it? Sales, marketing, profit. Yeah. As Robbie Robbins says, money again, definitely. Liesel says, it makes me so angry. Yeah. Yvonne, disgusting insensitivity, absolutely. John Hammer, right on back to merchandise, just shows you exactly where his heart is, where his mind is, where his priority is. He treats Elvis, he calls him my boy, or the boy, and the attraction. He doesn't see him as a person. And even now that Elvis has died, he's still a money-making venture for him, right? Stephanie says, selfish prick. Joy says, continue the con. Yeah. So that's the first part. The other part is he then does travel to Memphis after doing the merchandising, and he attends Elvis's funeral. Now, I don't know whether he visited Graceland before the funeral. I don't know if he was there only for the funeral and then he disappeared again. But this is what we do know. And if you were upset by what I've just told you, this is going to be even more upsetting. Again, this is from Wikipedia. It's not from some biased source. It's just a generic vanilla version. At Elvis's funeral, quote, mourners recall being surprised at Parker wearing a Hawaiian shirt and baseball cap, smoking his trademark cigar, and purposefully avoiding the casket. So even at the funeral, he's not dressed like you would expect everyone else to be dressed. Paying their respects. He's not paying respects. It's almost like he's saying, I don't respect Elvis. And he's Elvis's manager. He's the person who should have been the most grateful and the most respectful, you would think. So I'm just going to put that up. Let me read it again. Mourners recall being surprised at his wearing a Hawaiian shirt. It's not like he's just wearing like a white shirt and it seems a little bit inappropriate. It's totally inappropriate. It's totally inappropriate. It's disrespectful. And again, that's where you say, is there signs of psychopathy? Well, this seems to be clearly that, doesn't it? Yeah, it's someone who's actually died, and he can't even put aside whatever silliness is part of his makeup for a funeral, right? The part that I think is really, really significant here is where they say he purposefully avoided the casket. Now, I don't know how many of you know, at Elvis's funeral, the I'm not sure what they call it, open casket or something. But the funeral, the coffin's actually open, and you can actually see Elvis's face, right? And people noticed that the manager's not really looking at Elvis, didn't seem to approach the casket like most people do when they pay their respects in that situation. There's another aspect that's even more grotesque in a way, is that somebody took a photo in this funeral situation, took a photo of Elvis, and I think sold it to the National Enquirer. I think for, I don't know if it was $100,000, but that was the National Enquirer's best-selling publication ever, from the information I got. But you've got to wonder, did Colonel Parker, was it his idea? Was it his idea to take a photo of Elvis? Was that what he was preoccupied with at the funeral even? And it's possible that he didn't. It's possible that it was just something completely separate. I don't know. But you can't help wondering in terms of that. But what I think is important in terms of that, someone, and I think it was a family member, I think it was a cousin, who took this photo of Elvis. It's not just, I don't know what's worse, taking the photo of someone who's dead and it's a family member, and then selling that photo. I mean, didn't he take that photo for the purpose of selling it? And that's when you've got to think, it's not only the colonel who sees Elvis as a cash grab and a cash cow, it's other people around him as well. And that's the part that also makes it really quite sad. It's like, does everyone treat him like an ATM, right? No matter how much he's suffering, I can get something out of him for my benefit, but at his expense. I mean, what is more at someone's expense than taking a photo of them when they're dead and selling the photo? Just here says, I doubt Lisa Marie will have his autopsy unsealed in a few years. Well, it was sealed for 50 years, and it's supposed to be unsealed in 2027, in I think 2027, so in about 5 years' time. Okay. Zircon says Southerners take dead photos, though, so that's not a bad point, I guess. But this is also something to bear in mind, also from Wikipedia. At the funeral, this is at the funeral, Parker persuaded Elvis's father, Vernon, to sign over control of Elvis's career in death to him. In other words, sign over his legacy. So at the funeral, Parker's actually also wheeling and dealing with Elvis's father at the funeral. Now, if this isn't the calculating behavior of a psychopath, I don't know what is. If this doesn't show how Parker saw Elvis Presley as an attraction, nothing more, and perhaps an attraction worth more dead than alive, I'm not sure what does. Anyway, that brings us to the sixth point, duty of care. Again, the first half of these 8 points have really been dealing with the colonel. Now we're starting to deal a bit more with Elvis, right? Now, within this narrative, I want you to think Elvis has died. Elvis is no longer with us. Jimmy. Okay, so within this narrative, I want you to be cognizant of this sort of setup where Elvis has died, and now you think in retrospect, did you have a duty of care? And what I mean by that is, you almost think of his family members thinking about the colonel and thinking, are you taking care of Elvis and kind of us now that Elvis isn't there anymore? Or are you going to take care of yourself more? And that same psychology were you taking care of Elvis? And did Elvis die because of Elvis, or something else? Did Elvis die because of you? Did Elvis die directly because of you or indirectly because of you, or both? But which one more than the other? I do think you've got to say, as Elvis's manager, Parker had a duty of care towards his client, and that is why at the funeral it feels like that duty of care isn't there. Surely the most important person to go, or the most obvious person to go and pay his respects at the casket, should be his manager. Surely there were few people that had a closer relationship than they did, right? It comes up in many interviews that rather than taking care of Elvis, and by that I mean beyond financially, Parker was primarily taking care of himself. And that meant trapping, limiting, controlling, manipulating, and using Elvis. In this respect, I want to go to this New York Times article. It's this one. And there's a quote from the article. In one chilling scene in the movie based on fact, Elvis is in a drug haze with people dunking his face in ice water backstage at Vegas when the colonel comes up and tells the doctor to get the singer on stage no matter what they have to do. So if you haven't seen the movie, you really want to pay attention to this particular scene, because this particular scene stands out, where in front of a lot of people, the colonel shows, you can either use a euphemism and say he shows that he does not have this duty of care, or that he lacks a duty of care. I think the more on point way of saying it is that he's a psychopath. So you have a scene where Elvis is literally in a drug haze, and bear in mind he's going to die. I don't want to say that. I don't want to make it absolutely explicit that he dies of a drug overdose, but you've got to think about, here he is in a drug haze, and not long after that he will die, and drugs are part of that whole story, right? And so here he's literally in almost an emergency situation. It's like he needs to go to hospital, and he's almost like in a corridor backstage, and people are putting ice water on him, and he's sort of prostrated on the floor. He's lying on the ground, and it's obviously a bad situation. It's kind of like the Moab incident in the Gabby Petito case. This is like a big red flag saying danger, danger, danger. And the colonel comes up and tells the doctor, there's a doctor there. He tells the doctor, I don't know what happens, but what is definitely going to happen is at the end of this, he's going to be on stage. No matter what, he's going to be on stage. There's once again an illustration of what does it mean where something benefits the colonel at Elvis's expense. Well, here it is, because the colonel makes money out of every performance Elvis does. Elvis also makes money, but in this case, Elvis can actually lose, to some extent, his reputation, if he makes a mess. But if he's not healthy and he keeps performing, he can get burnt out, and basically you can have a Michael Jackson scenario. And I think Michael Jackson is a very sad analogy to this case, because they're so similar. They're very, very similar. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. Now, although we will deal in a separate analysis with the timeline of August 16, dealing with Elvis's death, it's important to stress that when a journalist reached out to Parker to tell him of Elvis's death, so again, I don't know the exact circumstances of where the colonel was and how he found out. That's why I really want to buy this book. But we do know that a journalist reached out to him, and when he did, and he got his reaction, without missing a beat, Parker said, "Why, I'll just go right on managing him." And that is exactly the impression you get, is that that is what he did. Elvis died, and he just carried on managing him. Louise says, I thought he died from a blocked colon that affected his heart. Louise, that's a very astute comment you've made. That is one, I don't want to be dismissive and say theory, but we are going to go into his autopsy in a episode totally dedicated to that. What I want to say at this point is that I think it's odd that we don't know the results of his autopsy. Why is it a secret? Why seal them for 50 years? If there's no intrigue, if it doesn't reflect badly on anybody, why seal the autopsy, right? Okay. So you asked a question in terms of this whole duty of care point. How is it possible that someone who was so loved by his fans, by the world, was treated with so little love by his manager, right? That's a really important question to ask. How is it possible that everybody loves Elvis, but not his manager, right? And Alana Nash, the author of his biography, she writes the following, and I think she's a great source for this. I want to ask the question again and then pause and just give you a moment to think about it, because she's going to provide an answer. But I want you to think, I want you to look at this picture of him, and I want you to think what you think the answer could be. I'll put the question in chat. How is it possible that someone who was so loved by his fans was treated with so little love by his manager? In other words, that's a question in terms of his psychology. Now, you might say, because he was a psychopath. Yes, but meaning what? How does a psychopath think, right? That's where you really got to answer the question. How does a psychopath, yeah, I'll provide the answer in a moment. I guess the question is, how does a psychopath not get emotional, right? And the answer isn't, well, he has no emotions, because he does have some emotions, but there's something that is unique to psychopaths that allows them to be quite effective and efficient in their processing, and we're going to deal with that. Julie says, look at those eyes. So this is the question. While you guys are thinking about it, I just want to respond to Connie Busey, who says, I think Connie seems to think that it was, I don't know whether you're saying that you think it was an overdose. But what you're right, that opiates can create constipation. The problem with the overdose theory is that Elvis appeared to die when he died. He appeared to die instantly. That's the problem with just the overdose theory. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at. I'm not. It seems like you're not. You're just referring to the opiates. But if you think that he just died of an overdose takes a while to kill you, whereas it appears Elvis died kind of instantly. Joy says Elvis was just a paycheck for Parker. Julie says he was livestock to Parker. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to deal with the answer. And this answer comes from Alana Nash. She says, so how do you treat someone with so little love, right? Answer. And this is from her direct experience meeting with him, talking with him. She says the following, quote, I will say that he, meaning Parker, had an amazing ability to compartmentalize events and feelings in his mind. So the question is, how can a psychopath not be affected by things? And the answer isn't that he isn't affected by it. The answer is that the things that are happening, he's able to put in boxes and sort of file them away. And we're going to get to the point where something does affect him. What does he do with it, right? So let me read that again. He says, I will say he had an amazing ability to compartmentalize events and feelings in his mind. If something troubled him too much, he was able to store it in a back corner of his consciousness, though he always had trouble keeping it there. Certainly, whatever happened in Holland that made him leave his family, with whom he was very close, and to just cut them off, was of a very grave nature, end quote. Now, I think the fact that Parker attended the funeral dressed like he was about to go on an expensive vacation to Hawaii, yet wouldn't approach Elvis's casket, bears this out, I believe. That is someone who's not just compartmentalizing, but sort of over compartmentalizing, right? The other thing that I think is really interesting about what she says there is he always had trouble keeping it there. So even though he could compartmentalize, so you might say he was a psychopath and maybe good at it, he nevertheless had trouble. If he put something in a compartment, it didn't always stay there, right? He had trouble keeping it there. And then you got to ask, how? How did this trouble of So you're good at compartmentalizing, but what's the problem, or how does this come back to bite you? How does it come back to haunt you? It does, because that's what she says. He always had trouble keeping it there. How do you have trouble keeping something in the back of your mind in reality? Well, we're going to get to that. Now we deal with the seventh and the penultimate reason why this person may have killed Elvis is his life was a lie. And that's a true crime rocket science ism. Usually when crimes take place, it's because someone is living a lie. Think about Chris Watts with his mistress living a lie. Think about Caitlin Armstrong in Costa Rica. She was trying to live a lie. And now think about this guy in America. His entire life is a lie. Parker's life in America was a lie. He was a gambler, a swindler, a puppeteer, a parasite, and he even referred to himself. And this is always so important when you're dealing with true crime and you're trying to figure out who someone is. Self-disclosures are sometimes the most important. Sometimes self-disclosures are misleading because they're wrong. So it's like me saying I'm a professional marathon runner, right? It's not true, right? But sometimes they are true. When they aren't true, you've also got to wonder why did he say that, and who, what is he hiding, and who does he really want to be? In this case, he describes himself gratuitously as the snowman. That's how he describes himself, as the snowman. If you think about a snowman, what do you think about? You think about a rounded figure. You also think about a very white figure, right? But you tend to just, in a general sense, think of a sort of bulbous figure, an overweight figure, who profits from the snow. When the snow falls, the snowman arises, kind of thing. And that comes from, I just want to bring up this particular headline. I think it's this one. No, it's not. It's this one. So there's an article in, I think it's in Screen Rant, why Tom Hanks's Colonel Tom Parker called himself the snowman. So why do you think he did? What do you think the answer is to that? What do you think the answer is to why did he call himself the snowman? Louise says Elvis never toured Europe or visited the UK. I wonder if that was due to Parker not wanting to come back here. Great point. That actually comes up in the film. Louise, have you seen the movie Elvis? I think you should if you haven't. Ricardo says maybe you could sell snow to an Alaskan. It's a good point. Okay, so let's deal with the answer here. Why was he called a snowman? According to Screen Rant, quote, being a predator was a source of great personal pride for Parker. I don't know if one can overstate those words. I think it's very well written. But think about how chilling those words are, especially if you are Elvis, right? Being a predator was a source of great personal pride for Parker. Isn't that just the definition of a psychopath, right? People talk about psychopaths all the time. What does a psychopath actually look, sound, and feel like? What do they actually do? Gathering Place says, ice snow is cold. Well said. Well said. Okay. Liesl McGuire said, not this Alaskan. Well said. Okay. So here we go. Let me read the whole thing again. Quote, being a predator was a source of great personal pride for Parker. However, so much so that Parker dubbed himself the snowman, a slight turn of the word, so a slight turn of phrase on the word showman. So snowman, showman, using the slang term snow, which is another word for con or trick. And from what I gather from that is, like if it's snowing, in a sense, one person, their vision is sort of blurred. They can't see very well. It's sort of fuzzy what's happening. Something's taking place, it's snowing, but they can't quite see what's happening, right? And within this snowing whatever fuzziness, a snowman arises and benefits from this event, right? So if you are successful at conning someone, you have gone from being a showman to a snowman, right? And you appear to be very harmless, but just look at this picture of Tom Hanks. He looks quite sinister, doesn't he? I mean, he's playing this guy, but look at that look on his face. And then look at this look. Where is it? Look at that look. Just trying to find where he's on the phone. There it is, yeah. But I guess that one as well. Look at that face. And think about him thinking of himself as the snowman. And he's kind of got a weird, cliched appearance. The cigar. He's not an American, and he's not Colonel Tom Parker. And so all of this is kind of a show. The bow tie, the cigar, the hat, the whole thing. And so, if you looked at him and you thought he was an odd dude and he's overweight or something, he's actually thinking, yes, but I'm actually running the show here. You might think I'm harmless, but I'm actually the opposite. And then the article goes on to say, quote, claiming there was no one more gifted at deceiving or snowing someone, Parker leaned heavily into his own joke, as Lerman shows in Elvis with Colonel Tom Parker's office overflowing with snowmen. So you might think that he liked this term snowman, right? But he actually took it really, really far. He had snowmen in his office. It was something that he kept reminding himself. And so he liked this idea of deceiving. And so the question is, didn't he deceive Elvis? Didn't he deceive Elvis as well? Wasn't that part of the whole thing? Wasn't he deceiving kind of the audience, right? And this sort of raises an awkward question. And so Joy says, didn't Elvis clue in? That's a really good question. It raises a really interesting question, which is if the snowman, if this guy was so obvious in what he was talking about, wasn't Elvis also intrigued, interested, part of the whole thing? You get what I'm saying? You might say this guy's a sociopath or a psychopath or a manipulator, but he was Elvis's manager, and Elvis and him worked together for a long, long time. So wasn't Elvis to some extent, I don't want to say an accessory, but someone who was very well aware of what this guy was trying to do, and then he went along with it. And so they were, in a way, what do they call it? Something of thieves, kind of like partners in what they were doing. Yeah, snow business. Well said, Robbie Robin. Snow business like show business. Well said. John Hammer says Elvis was tied in. Add in the drugs legal, he was in deep. Yeah. Jody says if you fool them once, you can fool them twice. Now, can you see how my original question now it gets a bit more complicated, where you say, you know what, this guy was a bad apple, but Elvis was Elvis an innocent victim in this? Or was Elvis a victim, but just not such an innocent victim? And that's why, if you look at this picture behind me, you see Elvis is holding the gun and he's doing that. Weren't they sort of playing at this together, right? It still makes you kind of wonder who was calling the shots. Look who's holding the gun. But is that true? Is it true that Elvis is holding the gun? Is it true that Elvis is calling the shots? Now, if you think about that whole incident where Elvis got, what's the word? I mean, I don't think there's any mystery here. We know that Elvis died at 42. He definitely wasn't calling the shots. The Colonel lived till 87, right? He lived twice as long as Elvis did. And he wasn't the most healthy living person in the world. I'm just trying to say it's not like the Colonel was all bad and Elvis was all good or innocent. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, if you get my meaning. Yvonne says a conditioned victim. Stephanie says flawed and human. Anne says symbiotic relationship, but the Colonel was in control. That's very well put. Very well put. I just want to sort of emphasize that Elvis was a player in his own game. And you might say it was also the Colonel's game, but he was nevertheless, it wasn't like he was completely unaware of it. Okay, so let's continue. So if Parker did get away with murder, I'm talking about in the Netherlands, right? I want you to think of that statement where he says, no one was more gifted at deceiving or snowing someone. And so he came up with this office overflowing with snowmen, and he thought of himself as a snowman, right? Because he's so good at deceiving. Now go all the way back to the Netherlands and ask yourself, if Parker did get away with murder, if he did kill Anna van den Enden, then wasn't he right? Wasn't he right that he was a snowman? He was good at deceiving people. He did get away with murder, and how many people do? Bear in mind, Caitlin Armstrong was a fugitive for 43 days. He was a fugitive for 58 years. Wasn't he right to think of himself as a mastermind? Wasn't he right that he had fooled in his time everyone? The movie repeats, if you go and watch the movie Elvis, it repeats over and over again how it delights Parker to get people to give away their money with a great big smile on their faces. And there's something psychopathic about that as well, that he's not just being a good promoter, he's not just on song with his marketing. there's something sly and evil and psychopathic about it, and it just tickles him pink that he's able to do that. And this is a good example of that. Elvis is a jerk. I hate Elvis, and he makes money out of that as well. So, as I say, the movie, if you're going to watch the movie, make sure you do go and watch it within the next couple of days. Try and make the effort. It'll give you a lot more to talk about and think about, because there's some aspects that are true, that dramatize very well, and there's some that are less well done. But one of the things you'll see in the movie is Colonel Parker actually wearing a white, looks like a white lab coat. And so he really takes on this persona of being a snowman. He really, really takes it on. And he thinks he's amazing. And then, as I say, at Elvis's funeral, he pitches up there with a Hawaiian shirt. So he is a bit of a dandy, dresses up, and he thinks a lot of himself, right? Parker even went so far as to create a club called the Snowmen's League of America, which is a sort of a rip-off of the Showmen's, I think the Showmen's League of America. It had membership cards, stationery, and all of this showed that this wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just like a little bit of a joke. He thought of it very, very seriously. And you must think that if he did murder Anna van den Enden, that he'd somehow created some sort of system where he thought he was bulletproof and he thought he was some kind of mastermind, not just in terms of a criminal, but he must have thought of himself almost like the Joker does, someone who's able to pull the strings of the whole world in a way, right? And let me see if I can show you this image. You could actually see him wearing white, and you can see snowmen and Elvis Presley and all that. It's from this particular picture. There you can see his. I wonder if I can actually show you where he's wearing like a white lab coat. See if I can quickly bring it up. I hope I can find it in a hurry. Here it is, I think. Now, this is quite a good. So in this particular image, you can see it says here, 50,000 Elvis fans can't be wrong. And look at him wearing like a lab coat. He's got what looks like a beret on, and it says Elvis Girls, and so on. There's another one that's even better than that one. Let's bring this one up. I'm just trying to show you how seriously he took his own thing, his own moniker. So here you can see him in it again. He's wearing like a white, looks almost like a dressing gown. Girls, Elvis, and there Elvis is. So again, if you think Elvis didn't know about the snowman thing, he obviously did. Here's another example. I'm sorry that it's so small. There's Elvis, and there is this sort of snowman coat. You can see he's kind of an eccentric character. I just want to see if I can bring up a better image than that. Here's another version of it. I think that's Elvis, but there he is again with that on. And here's one more. I'm pretty sure that's Elvis. There it says Presley. There's that thing. So you can see he's a very strange character. Do you agree? Very strange character. Oh, damn. Sorry, I'll have to go and show you. Okay, so there it is. Can't see, no picture. Okay, sorry about that. So let me try and bring those pictures up. Now I feel a bit silly. So anyway, there's what I've been trying to show you. There's Elvis over there. I think that's Priscilla. There it says Elvis. Quality is not that great with some of these pictures. There, as I say, there you see Elvis standing right next to him. On the coat, it says Elvis, girls, whatever. Elvis had to be part of this whole thing, part of some of the psychology. Just trying to see where the other one is. There you can see it looks like a movie set. There it says Presley on the side. Yeah, sorry about, and I'm sure Elvis had to know that this guy was also printing badges, I hate Elvis. But I mean, look at how it all ended. Elvis may have thought he's being very clever, but who was really masterminding even his fate? Okay, so it just shows that he's not just a little bit crafty. He's very into it. He thinks he's really, really clever. Okay, so a truism that only a psychopath could come up with. Parker once described himself and Elvis as the showman and the snowman. The showman and the snowman. I've got to say, when Parker spoke about snow, I thought it was about white powder and drugs. That was what came to mind when he said it. According to Screen Rant, quote, this may also allude to the idea that Parker never left his circus days behind him and saw the whole world as pennies to be plucked, with Presley as his dancing chicken. And, you know, you might think that's cleverly written, that Elvis was his dancing chicken. It's a clever way of putting it. But the Colonel literally had a show where he had dancing chickens. And literally what he did was he had a hot plate covered in sawdust. And obviously, because the plate was so hot, when he put chickens on there, the chickens seemed to dance. And he seemed to be making the chickens dance, right? That also shows a psychopath. It shows someone who's heartless, who's cruel, who's conniving, who's sly, who will do anything for money, even if it causes pain, right? He doesn't care if he inflicts pain on somebody else. If Parker admired himself for his cool, calculating mind, admired himself, he was nevertheless known for having a terrible temper. According to an excellent article in Smithsonian Mag, I think it's this article. Quote, the testimony of those who knew him was that Parker was a man of ungovernable temper. So remember, when you look at these pictures of him here, you know, he seems like almost like a clown, like a funny guy, right? But he's actually got a very, very bad temper. And do you remember what I said earlier about he can compartmentalize things because he's a psychopath, but it sort of comes back to bite him, right? He can push things to the back of his mind and whatever, but he's not perfect at it, right? He thinks he's very good, which is why he calls himself the snowman, but every now and then he finds he's melting or it's not as the environment isn't the way he needs it. And then he loses his temper. Then he gets hot-headed, right? Stephanie says he looks like a ringmaster. But that's really important, is that he's got a really bad temper. And it's not like he just loses his temper every now and then. He's got a really, really bad temper. Where do you think that comes from? That comes from compartmentalizing your emotions your whole life. I think one's got to also ask, in the Caitlin Armstrong case, was something like that also going on? Not to this level of extreme, but was she also compartmentalizing? Was she also trying to put a certain, I'm talking about before she went to Costa Rica, was she also trying to put certain elements of her past behind her, and maybe she'd worked quite hard to do that? And was it really frustrating to lose, or to feel like she was losing some of that? And then you have, remember, it said that she was shaking with anger, right? Yeah, very well said, Stephanie. Rage shown in Anna's murder. I mean, it wasn't necessary to hit her that hard. He could have just knocked her unconscious. So this, think about the anxiety involved in being a fugitive, carefully constructing this alter ego in a foreign country. Think about all the effort that goes into that, but also the worry, right? Am I going to be found out? You know, living a lie is something that is definitely kind of scary and difficult, and not for the faint-hearted. So he's gone through all of this effort to construct an alter ego in a foreign country. He's lost his home in the Netherlands. He's lost his family. He never sees them ever again. He's never even able to speak about them or be open about that, because that's going to give him away. That creates a personal cost. So around you, people are seeing their siblings and their aunts and uncles and whatever. Meanwhile, you are an outcast pretending not to be one. And there's a cost to that. And then within that sort of desert, within that being place of being destitute, and he did come to America with nothing. Having built an empire, he's still got to suffer witless fools and lambs in his mind. You know, he comes to America, he builds this empire, and he must think the people around me are witless worms, that they're fools, right? But he's got to suffer those fools. And this is why he always has trouble keeping that there. Not because he's a psychopath with absolutely no emotion, but because there is a little bit of emotion, and he's having trouble keeping it in check. So what do you think? What do you think after all of this? Do you think, was he a murderer? And that is really a double question. Did he murder Anna van den Enden, right? And did he murder Elvis? The first question is quite specific. It's kind of yes or no. The second one is, did he kill Elvis through 1,000 cuts? Was it through neglect? Was it through greed? Did greed kill Elvis? Was it the Colonel's greed? Was it the Colonel's greed and Elvis's greed? Was it the Colonel's greed, Elvis's greed, and our greed? Was it the Colonel's greed and Elvis's family? What is the main cause for Elvis's death? But I do think if the Colonel killed somebody else, then I think it's more likely and more rational to say he had a bigger role in being responsible for the harm that Elvis suffered. Does that make sense? So I'm just trying to see where this particular quote comes from, just so I can quote it properly. Just a second. Oh, it's from the Smithsonian Mag. Really good article. Just bring up another one of himself in the coat. Yeah, okay. Actually says, yes, Nick, he was exhausted, not necessarily drugged up. The Colonel drugs him up to get him up. Carmel Hughes says, huge factor in Elvis's demise. Okay, so this is from the Smithsonian Mag, really good article. Quote, I really don't think that there was a murder in him. Todd Slaughter, quite an ironic name, of the Elvis Presley fan club of Great Britain, told Alana Nash after knowing Parker for a quarter century. So that's one person's opinion. I really don't think that he had any murder in him. But others in the Colonel's circle disagreed. I don't think that there's any doubt that he killed that woman, said Lamar Fike, a member of Elvis Presley's Memphis Mafia. He had a terrible temper. He and I got into some violent fights. Let's just put that quote up for you guys. You know, for someone to say violent like that, that's pretty violent. You know, he doesn't just say, I got into some violent fights with him. Violent is obviously pretty violent. Judy says he contributed to the untimely death of Elvis, and the part he played was devoid of moral responsibility. It's that at the very least. I must say his behavior at the funeral, not looking at the casket, to me appears to be guilt. And you might say psychopaths don't feel guilt. I stick to my position. It looks like guilt. Then somebody else said, a guy called Byron Raphael said, it took very little to set him off. So it seems like he was a hot-headed guy who often got angry. And meanwhile, he appears like this joker. You know, he appears to be this funny guy making funny comments. But I think there's a very dark side to him. Then also from the Smithsonian mag, quote, in those fits of rage, he was a very dangerous man, and he certainly appeared capable of killing. He would be nice 1 second and stare off like he was lost, and then boom, tremendous force. He'd just snap. You never saw it coming. Then 5 minutes later, he would be so gentle, telling a nice, soft story. Now, I've highlighted these words, tremendous force. You never saw it coming, right? Isn't that a narrative match between the incident in Breda and the man that turned his world into a giant circus with himself as the ringmaster? I mean, that is ultimately what he turned Elvis into, a sort of a circus act in Vegas. Didn't he ultimately succeed at turning Elvis not into a king, but reducing him to a cowed, crooning circus act? And that brings us to the very last point here, lawsuits and a curveball. We begin to understand Colonel Parker a lot better when we follow the money, and we see for a man who was clearly all about money, made some incredibly dumb decisions in terms of his client. So this is where it gets really interesting. So when you look at the Colonel and you say, okay, you're a psychopath and you're very, very greedy and you're all about money and you'll do anything for money, then you say, okay, let's just concentrate on the money. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on that narrative. Turns out he makes some really daft decisions about money in terms of his client. So an example is in 1975, just 2 years before Elvis's death, Parker was offered, get this, $5 million. Bear in mind, this is quite a long time ago, almost 50 years ago. Parker was offered $5 million by the government of Saudi Arabia for Elvis to perform there. Colonel, $5 million to have your boy, come and appear in our country. He's not interested. Now, to get an idea of how much this offer was worth, after Elvis's death, Elvis was only worth $5 million. So this was a chance for Elvis to, because the Colonel would take 50%, Elvis could make, a sizable fraction of what he was already worth, just in one show, in one set of performances. And so what happens? Parker refuses this offer. He refuses the $5 million. So guess what? Saudi Arabia comes back with another offer, $10 million. So now Elvis can literally double the money that he ends up having by the time he dies. He can literally double his wealth. No, 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 we're not going to accept your offer. So Parker refuses that too. And in terms of, you know, as a manager, that doesn't make any sense. Like, wow, I thought your job is to earn us money. So he turns down offers like a $10 million invitation. That's a lot of money to turn down. It's not as though they were rolling, absolutely rolling in money. He also refused multi-million dollar offers from other countries, including Australia. And ultimately, all other foreign countries, the UK, Germany, Japan, all of them offered. And if you could have put some of that together, you know, Elvis could have been worth a huge amount of money. And so what does he do? He refuses all of these overseas offers, with the exception, I think, of a couple of shows he did in Canada. And of course, the Colonel didn't go with to Canada. Why do you think that was? Why do you think the Colonel didn't want Elvis to perform anywhere overseas? Well, it's not really such a long walk in the park, is it? But I think that had to have been hard. You might say it was obvious because he didn't have papers and they would have found out who he was, and you know, the whole passport thing. But it had to have been hard for such a greedy dude, for the snowman, to turn away so much snow. So if he was losing his temper, you can imagine that could have been one of the reasons why. That he has got to make a decision for him that benefits him, but that's to Elvis's expense, but it's kind of also to his expense in another way. I mean, he needs to stay in America and out of jail, but that's also going to kind of cost him. So I've got to say, what caught my attention in Elvis, as I said earlier, were the end credits, which showed how Elvis's daughter, how her estate successfully sued the Colonel for mismanagement. So after Elvis died, his daughter, not her herself, but her legal guardian, did a sort of an evaluation of the Colonel's sort of custodianship and found mismanagement, obviously irregularities. But why that interested me was at the end of the whole Elvis story, you had these legal um, issues being resolved, and that's where I sort of thought, wow, could there be a true crime element to this? And boy, was there! Boy, is there! I mean, it is pretty incredible, isn't it? And that's why I say, instead of just doing one episode, I'm going to be doing another 4 after this. So I think this is from Wikipedia. On August 14th, 1981, Judge Evans ordered Elvis Presley Enterprises to sue Parker for mismanagement. In response to this, Parker countersued. So he's also not a walkover. You take him to court, he's going to fight you. The case against Parker was settled out of court in 1983, with the estate paying him $2 million. That's over $5 million in last year's money. So you could actually argue that he won the case in court, except that he paid $2 million in exchange for all Presley audio recordings. So everything that he had, visual images, everything that he owned, he had to hand over. And so that allowed the legacy to finally be transferred to someone else. And so he basically had to give up his involvement in any Presley related marketing, which he didn't really do. He did continue to do things like postage stamps and other things, events at the Hilton Hotel. But let's come back to addressing the original elephant in the room. Where was Parker when he died? Parker actually answers this question in this interview. I would like to play it for you. Maybe I can. Let me just put it in chat. Terry Dean says, my parents took me to Graceland when I was 10. My dad called Parker a clown, the king and the clown. There you go. Tell your dad is True Crime Rocket Science now is on song, is on target. Okay, so I'm going to play you this clip. Like I say, I wanted to know where he was, and this seems to answer that question. So how am I going to do this? I think I'm going to do that. So you're not going to see me or hear from me for a few seconds while I bring this up. How am I going to do it? Well, let me do it like that. Okay, so this comes from Colonel Parker at ABC's Nightline. And I'm just going to play a few seconds of it. And this is where Parker says, when he passed away, I was on tour. Now, do you remember earlier we had information saying that he went to New York? Well, that seems to show that he wasn't wherever he needed to be at the time. Okay, so I'm going to bring up this. And let's just do it like that. I just need to turn the sound up. Just a second. Thanks a lot, Julie. Thanks a lot for that. Okay, I'm just going to need to put the sound up. Just a second. And then you guys will be able to hear it. Okay, this is from ABC's Nightline. Are you ready? There we go. Okay, so that's very soft. Let's try again. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can get it a bit louder. What it needs to be on 526. Okay, so it's about there. Okay, here we go.
It's been 10 years since Elvis passed away. When he passed away, I was on tour. I had to stay behind, close all up.
So that's really just the part I wanted to hear where he says, when he passed away, I was on tour. And that's the part we really need to confirm. Is that true? Was he on tour when he passed away? Right? That's also why I want to buy the book from Alana Nash. Thanks a lot, Julie. Okay, so look at what a harmless guy looks like there. He looks like quite a sweet fellow, right? But he doesn't always look that harmless. So, as I say, other reports suggest that he lived in Memphis and he wasn't on tour, but flew to New York to cancel events following Elvis's death. I can also tell you that immediately following the autopsy, Elvis's family requested the results be sealed for 50 years. That order expires in 2027, just, 5 years from now. We'll be dealing with the contradictions and speculations regarding Elvis's autopsy in the next analysis. Do you guys want me to deal with that in the next analysis, or do you want me to go deep into the Colonel story? Do you want me to do the autopsy next, or go deeper into the circumstances in Bradar? What do you guys think? John Hammer says, thanks a lot for the chat and info, always eye-opening. Stephanie says, who else did he manage? He only managed Elvis, but I mean, for a long time, but early on he managed a few other people. But he eventually made Elvis his only client. At one point, somebody said, do you think it's right that you take 50% of what Elvis earns? And then he said, that's actually not true. Elvis makes 50% of what I earn. Just shows you how he thought of Elvis. Louise says, deeper into Parker, please, Nick. So we'll do that then. We'll go deep into his backstory. Becky says, autopsy. Okay. Well, there are 2 saying Parker's history, 3. So we'll get to the autopsy eventually. We will deal with it. We're going to do all of this within the next week, so stay tuned. So a final word though on this story is that a month before Elvis died, right? Remember I said there were sort of lawsuits that are important to bear in mind, that were all about whether the colonel gets to keep and continue keeping Elvis's estate. And that's also a reason why I think he may have been involved in killing Elvis. He may have thought Elvis is worth more to me dead than alive, right? And then there were lawsuits that followed. But there's also a curveball. And the curveball is that the real reason Elvis died has got to do with something completely different. Did you know that a month before Elvis died, a book came out revealing the real Elvis to the world, right? And you can imagine that because Elvis was sort of in a weird way in cahoots with the colonel, you know, there was he did have some skeletons in the closet which we still need to deal with. You can imagine that would have made him anxious, stressed. It would aggravate his insomnia. It would create this need to take more drugs because he's upset and worried and all that kind of thing, because he's got to perform despite these concerns. And so a month before he died, a book came out, and an article about the book actually came out in the media on the day that Elvis died. You've got to ask, is that a coincidence? Is that a really big factor, or is that just part of a whole maelstrom of factors, of aggravating factors? You can imagine how much this book could have added stress and anxiety to Elvis in the last days of his life. You can imagine how worried Parker may have been about this idea of a book coming out about his number one, and his one and only client. A book's going to be coming out about him, but then also necessarily it's going to direct attention and perhaps suspicion towards him. It might jeopardize everything. It might show that what Elvis is doing isn't right, that he's a bad influence or whatever. And also, you know, like if the drug narrative had to come out, and he could lose everything, right? But history paints a different sketch of reality. So history seems to show that rather than the Parker being concerned about this book coming out, he actually liked it. It was like it was a lot like those negative news headlines. The question is, what is reality here? What do you think reality is here? For someone who didn't want Nash's book to come out, you really think he wanted this book to come out? So I think this also comes from that excellent article from the Smithsonian. I just want to make sure. Sorry, let me just give me a second. Sorry. I just want to bring up, there's another photo here of Parker's funny suits. Yeah, yes, one or two others that are definitely quite interesting. There's this one. Okay, so let me just bring up this page. There you can see him wearing this, looks like a lab coat. Here he is with dignitaries. Look at what he's wearing. There he is again. And Elvis is obviously going along with this. There you can see it quite clearly. There's a dog as well. Part of that. You can see it went into that in a big way, that whole lab thing. I'll put a link to that also there if you're interested in having a look. I just want to continue just saying that there's this other version of history where I just wish I could provide the quote from this. I'm just not 100% sure where this comes from. I think it's from. Seems to actually come from multiple sources. Anyway, this is the quote. Worried about the impact such details might have on his career, Presley, through his father, so Vernon, asked Parker to stop the publication of the book. So it's kind of like, did his father want the book not published, or did Parker? So, I mean, Parker is ultimately the guy who takes action. So you would think that Parker is the one that wants it stopped. So Parker did try and attempt to have this book stopped, but he failed to do so. So that's the one version of the story, that there was concern about this book, that Elvis was worried about it, and then his father asked Parker to stop the publication. But you can imagine that Parker would have done that anyway. Wouldn't need to be asked. But we do know that he made several attempts to have it stopped, right? But then there's another version of the story, Larry Geller, who says Parker actually secretly wanted the book to be published because it would open Presley's eyes to how bad he had gotten, meaning on terms of the drugs, and persuade him to do something about it. The reason why I don't believe that is there have been no signs that Parker really has a good bone in his body, right? Anyway, the book would eventually be published 1 year later on July 12th, 1977, 1 month before Presley's death. And you've got to kind of ask yourself again, did Elvis Presley die when this book came out to distract attention from the book? Because that's exactly what happened. When Elvis Presley died, no one paid any attention to the book. Was that the point? And if Elvis didn't die, would the book have caused very serious problems for the snowman and the showman? It's just an interesting thought. Okay, so that is my spiel for today. I hope you guys have found this quite interesting. It's definitely a bit of a different take on the whole true crime thing. We're not dealing with a high-profile case per se right now. It's certainly not, although it is a movie that is doing the rounds, I guess, wherever you are in the world. So, Corporal Deb, I'm also sorry that I seem to have shut you down. I just meant, I'm trying to deal with a story in a step-by-step way, and it's not going to work if that gets revealed ahead of time. So, but anyway, I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your interest in this as well. And I hope you're going to go and watch the movie. Julie says, I believe they said they regretted writing it. Zircon, I really don't think he wanted it published. I mean, the title of the book is Elvis, What Happened? And it's, I don't think, bear in mind where Elvis was at the time. You know, he was bloated, he was struggling, and I don't think the book wasn't about, it wasn't cheerleading the Elvis story, it was being critical of it, and it deserved to be critical. Yvonne says, good show, thanks very much. Louise is fascinating and terrific research, thanks very much. This took about 2 days to put together. It was definitely quite difficult, and as soon as you open one sort of can or one avenue, all of these other things open up as well. And so we're going to be dealing with that as well. Quite a long show, 2 hours 45. Ricardo says, thanks for taking us through what happened to Elvis. Stephanie says, yeah, I just didn't want spoilers. That is, I just didn't want that. Robbie Robin, that is a fantastic comment. It's a fantastic comment. That Parker made me think of Gachet. Absolutely. It's really a very similar situation where would Elvis have succeeded without the Colonel, and would the Colonel have succeeded without Elvis? It's quite an interesting thought experiment. You have the same with Van Gogh and Dr. Gachet. The one's nemesis seems to nevertheless be instrumental to the other's success, right? Gathering Place says the movie Elvis was 5 stars, so there's a good endorsement for you. Gathering Place, good to see you there, you and your dog. Carmel says, oh my God, TCRS, on that last site you linked pictures of Elvis with Jace wearing CTP movie coat. Yeah, absolutely. And Elvis says, food for thought. That's the idea. Okay, guys, I'm not going to take it further than that. I want to thank my mods that are here, definitely Stephanie, Bria, I'm not sure if you're still here, but thank you to the mods, and then also to the members and subscribers. If they're new subscribers, welcome. And please join us on our continuing journey. I won't be doing this tomorrow, but probably the next episode will be Thursday. And then probably Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then the last one probably Monday, something like that. Oh, Bria is still here. Bria, I think I must let you go. Let us both go so that we can get some sleep. It's about 2 a.m. in France, I guess. Bria, I hope it's not too hot where you are. So the next episode, I think, is going to be dealing with the details of that incident in Breda. You know, I'm going to be providing you with a bit more intel on that. So we'll see what happens. And then we can also deal with the autopsy. You might think there's not a lot there, but there's some very, very detailed information on Elvis and how he was found. And then also, we're also going to look at the timeline of his last hours, like what was he doing on the last day of his life. And you'll be surprised to find out that he was actually awake. He would normally be awake at night and he'd sleep in the day. So the last day of Elvis's life was actually the last night. And one of the strange things he did on the last night of his life was he went to the dentist, like at about 10:30 at night, and his dentist was available for him. So, okay, guys, thanks again. I will see you guys, as I say, not tomorrow for this series, but Thursday. Van Gogh Letters will continue tomorrow. I think it's episode 25. And yeah, I think you'll continue to enjoy this particular series. It definitely is quite interesting. If you haven't gone to watch the movie Elvis, try and go and watch it. It's made by this fellow and definitely is worth seeing. Definitely is worth seeing. So, sorry, let me just bring that up. Made by Baz Luhrmann and pretty well acted, I thought. Okay, so that's it from me. All the best to you guys. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, stay cool, stay safe. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, keep warm. And I'll see you guys next time. All the best. By the way, thanks a lot, Axie. Thanks a lot for that. Cheers. Louise says, what did the dentist give him? Well, you'll have to find out, but it was likely some kind of tooth treatment. Nothing more than that. Okay, see you guys next time.